The lights of Abu Dhabi shine bright as two of the most explosive fighters in mixed martial arts are about to collide. The atmosphere is electric, the fans on the edge of their seats, and the stakes have never been higher. UFC 280, October 22, 2022, was set to be a night to remember, with one of the most anticipated matchups ever. Khamzat Chimaev, the Boers with a ferocious, undefeated streak, against Colby Covington, the former welterweight champion known for his relentless pace and trash-talking bravado. This wasn't just a fight for bragging rights. It was a clash of styles, personalities, and, most importantly, a battle for the future of the welterweight division. As the fighters step into the octagon, the question on everyone's mind is, who will leave with their hand raised? Khamzat Chimaev had been nothing short of a phenom since entering the UFC. With his undefeated record and brutal finish streak, he quickly became a fan favorite and one of the most feared men in the sport. His rise was swift, with a style that was as terrifying as it was thrilling, blitzing opponents with brutal wrestling and devastating striking. The hype surrounding Chimaev had reached unprecedented levels, and many thought that he might be the one to finally dethrone the elite of the welterweight and middleweight divisions. But standing in his way was Colby Covington, a man who had been to the top, tasted championship gold, and had the heart of a lion. Covington's style was a stark contrast to Chimaev's. He thrived in the grind, using his cardio, wrestling, and pressure to break his opponents. Colby was known for never taking a step backward, constantly moving forward, and punishing his opponents with an unrelenting pace. His brash persona and trash talk had earned him both admiration and animosity, but his skill inside the cage was undeniable. Having already faced some of the best, losing in a razor-thin decision to Kamaru Usman in 2 epic bouts, Colby was no stranger to the pressure. He was no rookie, and he had one goal in mind, proving that he was still at the top of his game and capable of beating the new generation. But when these two men faced off, it wasn't just a fight for the belt. It was a statement from Chimaev that he was the future of the division, and a statement from Covington that no one could push him around. The tension was palpable as the crowd in Abu Dhabi watched closely, knowing that the outcome of this fight would have massive implications for the entire UFC landscape. As the fight began, it was clear that Chimaev's speed and aggression were his weapons of choice. He moved in fast, closing the distance with ease, and forcing Covington into uncomfortable positions. Colby, ever the veteran, was unflinching, his defense sharp, his footwork precise. The first round was intense, with both fighters having their moments. Chimaev's raw power was on full display, but Covington's technique and experience began to shine through. The fans were on the edge of their seats, unsure of who was gaining the upper hand. Round after round, the battle intensified. Chimaev's ferocity clashed with Covington's calculated approach, each fighter doing everything in their power to break the other. The fight was as close as it gets. Every exchange mattered, every takedown attempt was scrutinized, and every strike landed was felt. By the third round, it was clear that both men were exhausted but determined to push through. There was no quit in either fighter. But it wasn't just the physicality that made this fight so compelling. It was the mental chess match unfolding. Covington's ability to weather the storm and remain composed under fire was a testament to his championship pedigree. Chimaev, on the other hand, showed flashes of brilliance, demonstrating that he wasn't just a one-dimensional fighter. His heart, his drive, and his desire to prove himself were palpable as the fight wore on. As the final bell rang, the arena was buzzing with anticipation. The fight had been a war, unpredictable, brutal, and intense. But who had won? Who had done enough to sway the judges? The fighters embraced in the center of the octagon, showing respect after a battle that had pushed both of them to their limits. However, with the result left in the hands of the judges, fans and analysts alike were torn. It was too close to call. The tension was unbearable as the announcer prepared to read the decision. The crowd waited in anticipation, knowing that no matter what, one of these men had just proven they belonged among the best in the world. And while Chimaev had proven himself to be a force to be reckoned with, the question still remained, was he truly ready for the top? Had Covington done enough to show that he still had what it takes to reclaim the belt? As the dust settled after UFC 280, the echoes of the battle still hung in the air. Fans and analysts alike were left debating the outcome. Some praised Chimaev's relentless aggression, while others believed Covington's experience and composure should have earned him the victory. The atmosphere surrounding the welterweight division had shifted, and one thing was clear: the title picture had just become more complicated than ever before. But the real question that lingered in the minds of many was simple: where did this leave Khamzat Chimaev and Colby Covington? For Chimaev, the fight had been a proving ground. A chance to prove that his meteoric rise wasn't just a flash in the pan, but a sign that he was ready to take on the biggest challenges in the UFC. The victory, though hard-fought, had cemented his place as one of the top contenders in the division. But as much as fans had rallied behind him, they couldn't ignore the fact that his performance had been far from perfect. The cracks were starting to show. It wasn't just Covington's ability to stay in the fight and neutralize some of Chimaev's explosiveness. It was the mental battle that seemed to weigh on the young fighter. The more Chimaev pushed, the more Covington responded with an unwavering, methodical game plan. For Chimaev, the realization was hard to accept. Raw aggression might not always be enough to dethrone the champions. Then there was Colby Covington, the former champion, whose brash personality often overshadowed his talents inside the octagon, had shown a different side in this fight. He was no longer the trash-talking contender trying to bait his opponents into mistakes. Instead, he was the warrior who had endured the storm and remained unbroken. The loss was a tough pill to swallow for Covington. He'd given everything he had, but a few close exchanges had tilted the decision in Chimaev's favor. Yet, Covington's belief in himself never wavered. For him, this was just another chapter in his pursuit of reclaiming the welterweight title. But with Chimaev's name now looming large over the division, Covington couldn't afford to let his momentum slip away. He was back at square one, but this time, the path to the top seemed more daunting than ever before. Despite the victory, Chimaev couldn't shake the feeling that the fight had exposed weaknesses he hadn't anticipated. The tension between his instincts and his strategies had created a mental block that he wasn't used to. For someone who had steamrolled through his opponents, being pushed to the limit by Covington was an experience that would leave a lasting impression. As he reflected on the fight, he realized that in his pursuit of finishing his opponents quickly, he might have neglected the nuances of high-level MMA competition. The technical side of the game, which Covington had mastered over years of experience, was something Chimaev had yet to fully grasp. It was a humbling moment for a fighter who had once believed that his sheer dominance would carry him through every challenge. Behind closed doors, Chimaev's camp began to analyze the fight from every angle. His team, known for their precision and focus, was beginning to question if their young prodigy was ready for the next step. The UFC's welterweight division wasn't the same as it had been when Chimaev first entered the promotion. It had evolved into a chess game, one where every fighter had their own strengths, strategies, and ways of turning the tide in their favor. Chimaev's raw power and speed had gotten him this far, but could they take him to the championship? His team knew that the path forward would require more than just physical prowess. It would require a fighter who could read the game, adapt, and outsmart his opponents. At the same time, Colby Covington was far from finished. After the fight, there were no signs of him slowing down. Despite his loss, Covington's resolve remained unshaken. In many ways, the fight with Chimaev had reminded him of what he had built over the years: his wrestling, his cardio, and his relentless mental fortitude. But Covington knew the narrative was shifting. The new generation of fighters like Chimaev were gaining more attention, and the welterweight title seemed more elusive than ever. He needed a plan, a new approach. Maybe it wasn't just about talking his way to the top anymore. Perhaps it was time to reassert his position with another dominant win, one that would put the welterweight division on notice that Colby Covington was still the fighter to beat. The division was swirling with possibilities. As the UFC brass watched the aftermath of UFC 280 unfold, they couldn't help but feel that they were witnessing the birth of a new rivalry, one that could define the future of the welterweight division. The world was watching closely, eager to see what Chimaev and Covington would do next. As UFC fans eagerly speculated on what was next for both men, there was an undeniable feeling that this rivalry had only just begun. Could Chimaev continue to evolve and truly become the dominant force everyone had hoped for? Or would Covington's experience and grit prove to be the key to stopping the rise of the new generation? The answers would soon become clear, but until then, the tension between these two fighters continued to simmer, with the promise of an epic showdown looming in the distance. For both Chimaev and Covington, the road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they were both hungry, and their stories were far from over. The welterweight division had its new stars, but the battle for the top was anything but decided. Would Chimaev take the crown and usher in a new era, or would Covington prove that experience still reigns supreme? Only time would tell, and the stakes had never been higher. As weeks passed, after UFC 280, the ripples from Chimaev's split decision victory over Covington continued to stir the welterweight division. It became clear that the result had left many questions unanswered, and the fighters themselves felt the weight of those lingering doubts. Chimaev, despite his win, was still haunted by the moments in that fight when Covington had managed to stand his ground, to push him into uncomfortable positions. He had won, but something deep inside him told him he wasn't yet the fighter he aspired to be. It wasn't just about the split decision, it was about the nagging feeling that he hadn't fully proven himself. There was still a gulf between him and the true champions of the sport, and for a man as driven as Chimaev, that was something he couldn't ignore. The pressure was mounting in ways Chimaev had never experienced before. He had come into the UFC with an aura of invincibility, fighting with a style that made fans and fighters alike believe he was destined for greatness. His undefeated streak, his quick finishes, his intensity, they all painted the picture of a fighter who couldn't be stopped. But this win over Covington had peeled back a layer, revealing the cracks in his game. It was as if the spotlight had finally caught him in a moment of vulnerability. There was no denying that he had immense potential, but potential alone wouldn't be enough to conquer the welterweight division. If he wanted to truly dominate, he needed to evolve, and that evolution would be far from easy. In the quiet of the gym, Chimaev spent countless hours refining his skills, poring over every detail of his performance against Covington. He analyzed the moments when his pace had slowed, when Covington had been able to dictate the exchanges. Chimaev was relentless in his pursuit of improvement, yet the more he trained, the more he realized just how much he still had to learn. There were no shortcuts now. He was no longer a rising star. He was a man standing on the precipice of greatness, but only if he could adapt. The hunger for success burned within him, but the fear of failure grew with each passing day. His mind raced with doubts. What if he couldn't improve? What if this was as good as he would ever be? Meanwhile, Colby Covington was fighting a different battle, one that had been raging inside him for years. The loss to Chimaev had stung, but for someone who had weathered the storm of a career filled with controversy, challenges, and near misses, this was just another obstacle. Covington had always lived in the shadow of criticism and underestimation, and the split decision loss to Chimaev only added fuel to that fire. But what truly gnawed at him wasn't just the fight, it was the fear that his time at the top might be slipping away. The UFC was a young man's game, and with contenders like Chimaev rising through the ranks, the window for Covington to reclaim his former glory seemed to be closing faster than ever. His camp was buzzing with discussions on how to get back to the top. Covington knew he had to stay relevant, but he also knew that there was no room for complacency. The loss to Chimaev had been a harsh reminder that in the UFC, you're only as good as your last fight. Covington's team began devising a strategy, not just for his next fight, but for his entire career. They knew that Colby's reputation as a trash talker would only take him so far. If he was going to get back into title contention, he needed to prove that he could still perform at the highest level, something that many doubted after his loss to Kamaru Usman, and now, even more so, after the narrow defeat to Chimaev. The storyline of Colby Covington's career was in danger of being written by others. He had spent years building his persona as the bad guy, the villain who would do anything to get under his opponent's skin. But what if that was all fading? What if, after all the trash talk and headline-grabbing antics, Colby was left with nothing but the realization that his time in the spotlight had passed? He wasn't about to let that happen without a fight. Covington had built a career on adversity, and this moment was no different. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that it wasn't about the trash talk anymore. It wasn't about getting inside the heads of his opponents. It was about proving, once and for all, that he was still the best fighter in the world, and that meant going through Chimaev, the rising star, who seemed to be on the fast track to the top. And then there was the tension between the two fighters that bubbled beneath the surface, growing with each passing day. The animosity between Chimaev and Covington was undeniable, but it wasn't just about the fight, it was about the clash of ideologies. Chimaev represented the new wave of fighters, the younger generation hungry for dominance, while Covington was a representation of the old guard, the fighters who had already proven themselves and were now fighting to maintain their relevance. It was a battle of philosophies, the raw power and hunger of the new challenger versus the experience and determination of a fighter who had been there before. Both men understood that the world was watching. The UFC had set the stage for a potential rematch, a chance for both Chimaev and Covington to settle their differences once and for all. For Chimaev, it was a chance to prove that his victory had been no fluke, that he could, in fact, overcome the mental and technical obstacles that Covington had exposed. For Covington, the rematch was a shot at redemption. If he could beat Chimaev, it would prove that he was still a force to be reckoned with, and that the new generation hadn't yet surpassed him. As both fighters continued to prepare, the tension only grew. Chimaev's camp was tight-lipped, with the focus solely on improving his game. But in the back of his mind, Chimaev knew that another loss, even by a close decision, would send him back to square one. The spotlight was on him now more than ever, and the pressure to perform was unbearable. He couldn't afford to make the same mistakes again. Every move, every decision had to be perfect. Covington, on the other hand, was all too aware of the stakes. He knew the world was doubting him, and that was exactly why he couldn't afford to lose. His career was hanging in the balance, and he was determined to prove that the old guard still had a place at the top of the sport. He trained relentlessly, not just focusing on his strengths, but also working on his weaknesses, knowing that Chimaev's relentless aggression would force him into uncomfortable positions once again. The stage was set for a rematch that would have lasting ramifications for the future of the welterweight division. Both men were poised to clash once again, but this time, the stakes were higher than ever. The result of this fight would not just define their careers, it would shape the landscape of the UFC for years to come. With so much on the line, the question remained, who would emerge victorious, and who would be left to pick up the pieces of their shattered dreams? Only time would tell, and the tension continued to mount, leaving fans on the edge of their seats, eagerly awaiting the next chapter in this epic saga. As the weeks dwindled down to the fight, every moment seemed to carry more weight. Chimaev's mind was constantly racing, haunted by the memory of his battle with Covington. Despite all the hours of training, the relentless focus on refining his weaknesses, a part of him couldn't shake the unease. The UFC's welterweight division had grown more dangerous with every passing day, and the closer the rematch with Covington loomed, the more the reality of the situation set in. He wasn't just fighting for a win, he was fighting for his place at the top. His entire career was on the line. If he couldn't prove that his initial victory over Covington wasn't a fluke, the narrative surrounding him would shift. The pressure wasn't just external, it was internal. He knew how fragile this moment was. A loss would mean questioning his potential, questioning his worth as a fighter. His training camp became a battle against his own doubts. Every sparring session felt like a mini-fight, each moment of success or failure weighing heavily on him. His team had prepared him for this moment, but there was still that nagging uncertainty. Covington wasn't just an opponent, he was a fighter who had faced the best, who had proven time and again that he could withstand the storms. Chimaev knew that beating him would require more than just raw aggression. It would require intelligence, patience, and the kind of adaptability that had often eluded him in the past. Covington, for his part, was equally consumed by the fight. He had been through countless battles, both in the octagon and outside of it. But this one was different. There was no longer just a title to chase. There was his legacy. If he couldn't defeat Chimaev in the rematch, the world would see him as a fighter on the decline. His brash persona, his bold statements, his past successes, they would all become meaningless. And that terrified him. The welterweight division was evolving, and with fighters like Chimaev on the rise, Covington was feeling the weight of time pressing against him. Could he reclaim his spot at the top? Or would the new generation leave him behind? The intensity of the mental battle was palpable. Covington's team pushed him harder than ever before, drilling him on his technique, on his conditioning, on everything he would need to survive Chimaev's onslaught. His camp became a study of Chimaev's style. They analyzed every inch of footage, dissecting his movements, his reactions, his tendencies. Covington's confidence remained unwavering, but even he couldn't help but admit the challenges ahead. Chimaev was fast, explosive, and had an unrelenting aggression that many fighters struggled to deal with. But Covington had experienced something that could not be measured in mere numbers. He had been in the cage with some of the best in the world, and he had come out on top. That experience, that wealth of knowledge, would be his weapon in the rematch. As fight night drew nearer, the tension between the two fighters grew thicker. The press conferences, the interviews, the social media posts, all of it was laced with an underlying animosity. Chimaev was more focused than ever, but there was a fire in his eyes that couldn't be ignored. Covington, too, was a man transformed by the stakes of this fight. There were no more jokes, no more distractions. This was serious. This was about proving, once and for all, who the best fighter in the welterweight division was. It was about silence, the critics, about burying the doubt, about putting the past behind and cementing his place in UFC history. The build-up to the rematch became an event in itself. The media buzzed with speculation about who would come out on top. Fans were divided. Some believed in Chimaev's youth and power. Others backed Covington's experience and technical prowess. Everyone knew this fight would be a war, a true test of character and skill. There were no easy answers, no clear favorite. And as the fight week approached, the stakes seemed to rise by the hour. On the day of the weigh-ins, the atmosphere was electric. The tension was almost unbearable. Both fighters stood face to face, with the weight of the world on their shoulders. Chimaev's eyes were locked on Covington, cold and unwavering, but it was hard to read what was going through his mind. Covington, in his usual fashion, smirked, trying to maintain his bravado, but even he couldn't mask the intensity that lay beneath the surface. This was more than just a fight. It was a defining moment in both of their careers. It was a chance to prove to the world that they were the best, that they belonged at the top, that they could withstand the pressure of the moment. In the days leading up to the fight, the UFC's promotional materials and trailers played on repeat, stoking the fires of anticipation. Fans filled the arena in Abu Dhabi, the atmosphere thick with excitement. The roar of the crowd could be felt even from backstage. Chimaev and Covington both knew that the octagon would be their stage, but the weight of that stage was different for each man. Chimaev was determined to show that his initial victory had not been a fluke. He wanted to silence the critics, to prove that his rise wasn't just about hype. He wanted to show that he was the future of the welterweight division. Covington, on the other hand, had nothing to lose except his career. This was his chance to reaffirm his place among the elite, to remind the world that experience and determination could overcome even the fiercest challenges. The moment the bell rang, the crowd fell into a hushed silence, the anticipation so thick you could feel it in the air. Chimaev surged forward, looking to impose his will early, but Covington's footwork and timing kept him at bay. Every strike from Chimaev was met with Covington's calculated defense, a reminder of just how much experience mattered in this game. The first round was a back-and-forth affair, with each fighter landing significant blows, neither willing to give an inch. The crowd was on the edge of their seats, caught between the explosive aggression of Chimaev and the technical mastery of Covington. But as the round wore on, the cracks began to show in Chimaev's approach. His attacks were relentless, but they lacked the finesse needed to break Covington's defenses. And Covington, despite absorbing the pressure, remained composed, countering with sharp strikes and movement that slowed Chimaev down. As the fight went into the second round, the tension continued to build. Chimaev was more aggressive, but Covington's resilience was evident. Every punch from Chimaev that landed was met with a counter, and every time it seemed like Chimaev was about to break through, Covington's experience kept him in the fight. The stakes were becoming clear. This fight was far from over, and with each passing second, it was becoming more evident that the resolution would not come easily. Would Chimaev's youthful hunger and power prove to be enough, or would Covington's experience and resolve prevail? The answers were coming, but no one could predict how this war of wills would end. The octagon was a battleground, and both fighters knew that only one would leave victorious. As the fight continued, the crowd's energy was electrifying, each moment more intense than the last. The first round had shown that Chimaev's aggressive tactics weren't as unstoppable as many had believed, and Covington's resilience was turning the tide in his favor. But then, something unexpected began to unfold, a shift in the atmosphere that no one, not even the most seasoned analysts, had anticipated. Chimaev, normally known for his unrelenting pace and ability to overwhelm his opponents, began to show signs of slowing down. His strikes, which had been landing with power in the opening moments, were becoming more labored. The fire that had once burned in his eyes seemed to flicker, replaced by a quiet, unspoken frustration. His movements weren't as fluid as before. His gas tank seemed to be draining faster than he had prepared for. Covington, ever the strategist, began to take advantage, slowly chipping away at Chimaev's momentum. But then, in a shocking turn of events, just as the momentum seemed to fully shift in Covington's favor, Chimaev delivered a wild, desperate flurry of strikes, catching Covington off guard. For a split second, the cage was filled with a deafening roar as the crowd surged with excitement. Chimaev's intensity had returned, and he pressed forward with a renewed sense of urgency. But in the midst of this exchange, a sudden misstep led to a shocking twist. The moment everyone thought was going to be his breakthrough instead became his undoing. Chimaev, off balance from the exchange, attempted to pivot, but his knee buckled awkwardly beneath him, sending him crashing to the mat in agony. The arena fell into an eerie silence. For a moment, no one knew what had just happened. The fighters paused, and Chimaev's face twisted in pain as he clutched his knee. Was it an injury? Had his training caught up with him? Was this the sign that the fight was slipping away? The ref stepped in immediately, stopping the action as Chimaev struggled to recover. The crowd was on edge, unsure of whether this was just a temporary setback or a critical turning point in the fight. Covington, who had been on the verge of finding his rhythm, watched cautiously, knowing that this could either give him the upper hand or throw a wrench into the entire fight. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Chimaev might not be able to continue. Camera zoomed in on his face, the pain unmistakable as he attempted to rise to his feet. The atmosphere in the arena was tense, as fans and analysts alike speculated on whether Chimaev would be able to push through the injury. If he couldn't, it would be a devastating blow to his career and to the narrative of his rise to dominance. This wasn't just about losing a fight. This was about losing the momentum he had built, the invincible image that had been so carefully crafted. As the medical team tended to Chimaev, the drama inside the octagon intensified. The longer the delay, the more Covington's confidence grew. The time between rounds seemed to stretch forever, each second drawing out the tension even further. Covington remained calm, but internally, he knew that this was his moment to capitalize. If Chimaev couldn't continue, it would be the greatest opportunity of his career to not just win, but to silence the doubters once and for all. His legacy could be secured with a victory over Chimaev, especially if it came under such dramatic circumstances. But just as the medical team was preparing to make an official call, Chimaev stood up, grimacing in pain but showing signs of determination. He took a few limping steps, testing the weight on his injured knee. The arena held its breath, and for a moment, it seemed as though time itself had slowed down. Would he be able to continue? Was he too injured to fight? Or would he summon the strength to fight through the pain and prove that nothing, not even an injury, could break him? The tension in the air was palpable, the anticipation of the next move hanging over the fighters and the fans alike. No one knew what to expect next. Chimaev, clearly struggling but unwilling to quit, nodded to the referee and signaled that he could continue. The crowd erupted in both relief and disbelief. How could a fighter with a possible injury still be willing to risk it all? This was no longer just a fight for victory. It had become a battle for pride, for Chimaev's identity, for the legacy that was still being written. As the fight resumed, the dynamic in the octagon shifted dramatically. Chimaev, now clearly compromised, fought with a sense of desperation. Every movement seemed deliberate, every strike more cautious than before. He knew he couldn't rely on his usual relentless pace, and Covington, ever the tactician, adjusted quickly. He began to capitalize on Chimaev's injury, targeting the compromised knee with calculated precision. Every time Chimaev lunged forward, Covington would move just enough to avoid the worst of his attacks and land a strike that would further weaken Chimaev's already faltering defenses. The crowd's energy surged again, but this time it was not from excitement. It was from the tense anticipation of whether Chimaev could survive this onslaught. With each passing minute, the fight became a contest of wills. Chimaev was no longer just fighting Covington. He was fighting against his own body, against the limitations that had suddenly appeared where there had once been invincibility. Covington's experience and composure were shining through in a way that hadn't been seen before. His confidence grew as the fight wore on, and it was clear that Chimaev was struggling to keep pace. Every time Chimaev tried to regain control, he found himself vulnerable, and Covington seized every opportunity to further tilt the fight in his favor. Yet, even with all the odds stacked against him, Chimaev's resolve seemed unshakable. As the second round came to a close, both fighters were clearly exhausted. The audience was on edge, sensing that something monumental was unfolding. Chimaev had fought valiantly despite the injury, but Covington's relentless pressure and technical prowess were slowly taking their toll. The stakes had never been higher. If Chimaev could find a way to turn the tide, if he could push through the pain and show the world that he was more than just a fighter, this would become a defining moment in his career. But if Covington continued to capitalize on the injury, it could mark the end of Chimaev's rise and solidify Covington's place at the top once again. The fight had entered a new phase, one where every second felt like it could change everything. As the third round began, the tension in the arena reached its peak. Both fighters were battered, fatigued, and seemingly on the edge of exhaustion. Chimaev's knee was still a liability, but his heart and determination refused to let him give up. Every step he took seemed calculated. His movement had slowed considerably, but the fire in his eyes was still burning. The world was watching this fight was no longer just about who would win, but about who could endure the most. Chimaev knew he had to dig deeper than ever before. If he wanted to maintain the promise he had made to himself, to his fans, and to the sport, he had to find a way to defy the odds. Covington, sensing the opportunity, ramped up his attack. He was relentless now, taking full advantage of the weakness in Chimaev's movement. Every time Chimaev tried to throw a punch or initiate an exchange, Covington's countering technique kept him at bay, landing sharp strikes to Chimaev's injured leg. It was clear that Chimaev was struggling to maintain his usual pace. Covington was finding his rhythm, stepping in and out with precision, turning each moment into a tactical masterpiece. It was becoming painfully clear to the fans in the arena that the momentum had shifted entirely in Covington's favor. And yet, Chimaev wasn't finished. In the face of overwhelming adversity, something incredible began to unfold. As Covington prepared for another attack, the unexpected happened. Chimaev, with what appeared to be the last of his strength, launched forward with an almost reckless intensity. It was a wild swing, but it caught Covington off guard. For a brief moment, it felt like time had slowed. The strike hit hard, but it wasn't just a simple punch. It was a moment of pure heart, a desperate cry for victory. Covington staggered back, his balance thrown off. The crowd exploded into a roar of disbelief. Chimaev, though clearly injured, had found a way to land a telling blow. But even that wasn't enough to take down the experienced Covington. For a moment, it seemed like the fight might slip away once again. Covington, despite the hit, managed to regain his footing and continue to press the attack. But Chimaev's unwavering resolve wouldn't let him back down. The battle between them was no longer just physical, it was a psychological war. Chimaev's pain, his fatigue, and his injury had all been building toward one singular moment, his need to prove that he wasn't a flash in the pan. He wasn't just the rising star everyone talked about. He was a warrior, capable of withstanding more than anyone could have imagined. And in that moment, the two men collided again, both exhausted, both on the verge of collapse, but neither willing to yield. In a surprising twist of fate, as the round came to a close, it wasn't the fighter with the most damage who seemed to have the final word. It was the fighter who had the heart to keep going despite it all. Covington, despite his technical brilliance, seemed to slow down. He was on the defensive now, trying to recover from that last, shocking blow. Chimaev, sensing the shift, pushed forward one last time. With a burst of energy that no one saw coming, he exploded into action. In a split second, the fight went from being a close contest to a near-dominating display by Chimaev. He pressed the attack with everything he had, landing a flurry of punches that left Covington unable to defend himself effectively. The crowd was on their feet, roaring with excitement, as Chimaev's powerful strikes seemed to break through the defenses that had once seemed impenetrable. Just when it seemed that Chimaev had the fight in hand, the final twist unfolded. Covington, in a last-ditch effort, managed to grab hold of Chimaev's compromised knee during the exchange. He tried to pull off a takedown, but Chimaev, fueled by the desperation of the moment, found a way to break free, keeping himself upright. The intensity of the final moments was almost unbearable, as both fighters struggled for control, the clock ticking down. In the final seconds, with both men completely exhausted, it was clear that this would come down to the judge's decision. Neither fighter had been able to completely dominate. Both had their moments of brilliance and their moments of vulnerability. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the fight, the crowd fell into a tense silence. The battle had been one of the most intense, back-and-forth slugfests seen in recent memory, but the outcome was still uncertain. The fighters stumbled back to their corners, their bodies bruised, battered, and barely able to stand. Chimaev had shown the world his heart, his resilience, and his willingness to fight through adversity. Covington, too, had proven that his experience and technical mastery were far from diminished. The judges made their way to the center of the octagon, and the tension was palpable. Every fan in the arena, every fighter, every analyst was holding their breath, waiting for the decision that would decide the fate of this epic battle. As the referee raised Chimaev's hand, the crowd erupted in disbelief. Chimaev had won the fight by split decision. His victory wasn't just a victory in the octagon. It was a victory over himself, over his doubts, and over the injury that had threatened to derail his career. The arena was filled with a mix of cheers and stunned silence. Covington, despite his best efforts, had come up short. He had fought bravely, but it wasn't enough. But then, just as the crowd settled and the announcement was made official, a shocking final twist left everyone stunned. Chimaev, still limping and battered, took a moment to speak into the mic. He didn't thank the fans or celebrate the win. He addressed Covington directly, saying, "This wasn't just my win, it was a fight against all the doubts. But Covington, you pushed me further than I ever thought possible. You made me question everything about myself. I owe you for that." The crowd went silent once again, unsure of how to respond. Covington, with a wry smile, nodded in acknowledgement. His defeat had been bitter, but this moment of mutual respect seemed to catch everyone off guard. It wasn't just a fight for a title, a career, or a legacy. It was a fight between two men who, in the end, recognized the power of resilience in each other. The twist was not just in the fight itself, but in the unexpected respect that emerged between the two warriors. The aftermath of the fight would live on in the minds of fans for years to come. Chimaev had solidified his place at the top of the division, but Covington had once again proven why he was a force to be reckoned with. Neither man was quite the same as they had been going into the fight, but both had emerged stronger in ways no one had predicted. The legacy of UFC 280 would be defined not by the outcome, but by the way two fighters, through their battle, redefined what it meant to truly fight. The aftermath of UFC 280 was nothing short of legendary. As the dust settled and the arena lights dimmed, the echoes of the crowd's roar still lingered in the air. Chimaev stood tall in the center of the octagon, victorious, yet visibly battered and exhausted. His body ached, his knee throbbing with every movement, but it was the victory he had fought for, not just over Covington, but over the limits that had been placed on him, over the doubts that had clouded his rise. The entire evening had been a test, not only of physical strength, but of mental resilience. It was a fight that had defied the expectations of fans, analysts, and fighters alike. As he made his way to the backstage area, Chimaev couldn't help but reflect on the significance of what had just transpired. This wasn't the decisive, dominant win many had expected from him. There was no picture-perfect knockout, no overwhelming submission that would define his legacy. Instead, this was a victory earned through grit, perseverance, and the rawest form of willpower. It had taken everything he had. The entire journey had been defined by moments like these, the moments that separated the true champions from the contenders. Chimaev knew this fight would be remembered as one of his defining moments. But it wasn't just about the victory. It was about the journey, the struggles, and the understanding that a champion is not someone who always wins without difficulty. A champion is someone who fights through the hardships, who faces the trials head-on and keeps moving forward, even when the odds seem insurmountable. But there was a lingering feeling, one of unfinished business. Covington's challenge had forced him to go beyond what he had believed were his limits, and the victory felt bittersweet. There was respect between the two fighters now, but that respect also came with a shared understanding. Their battle wasn't over. They had pushed each other to the brink, and neither fighter would forget the lesson they had learned. In Covington's eyes, Chimaev had earned the victory. He had fought through adversity, showing a level of heart that few could match. But Covington wasn't one to back down from a challenge, and he had already made it clear in his post-fight interviews that he would be back. This fight had been a war, but in his mind, it wasn't the final chapter. For Chimaev, however, the fight symbolized something more profound. It wasn't just about continuing to climb the rankings or asserting his dominance in the division. It was about proving to himself, to the fans, and to the world that he had what it took to overcome the toughest challenges life could throw at him. The road ahead would be filled with even tougher opponents, more obstacles to overcome. But he had shown himself that he was not just a fighter with a bright future. He was a fighter who had already been forged in the fires of adversity. In the days that followed UFC 280, Chimaev found himself reflecting on the nature of his journey. He had risen quickly to fame, becoming one of the most talked about fighters in the sport, but the success had also brought with it a constant weight. Expectations were high, the pressure relentless, and the eyes of the world were on him every time he stepped into the cage. But what was truly clear now was that the expectations didn't matter. It wasn't the hype or the pressure that defined him. It was his response to those moments that shaped who he was. The fight with Covington had been a test, but it had also been a revelation. He had fought his hardest, endured more than most could handle, and emerged victorious. The greatest lesson of all was that every victory, no matter how big or small, came with its own set of challenges, but they were the very things that allowed him to grow. Covington, too, wasn't one to be overlooked in the aftermath of the fight. His legacy was far from finished. As much as the loss stung, it wasn't a blow to his career, it was an opportunity to evolve. He had shown everyone that he was still a formidable force in the division, and he wasn't going anywhere. His game plan had been almost perfect, and the only reason he had faltered was due to Chimaev's relentless heart and a few key moments where the tide of the fight had turned unexpectedly. Covington's technical skill was still second to none, but it was his understanding of the mental aspect of fighting that had been his real advantage. He knew how to frustrate his opponents, how to make them question themselves. In his mind, the fight wasn't over. A rematch, perhaps, would be in the future a chance to right the wrongs, to prove once again that he could outsmart and outlast anyone in his path. The media coverage in the weeks after UFC 280 reflected the importance of this battle. Fans and analysts alike couldn't stop talking about the heart and tenacity on display, and the fight was lauded as one of the most unpredictable and hard-fought bouts in recent UFC history. Chimaev's star had only risen higher, but now the talk wasn't just about his potential. It was about the fighter he had proven himself to be. The talk of the sport had shifted from how good is Chimaev to what will Chimaev do next. And that was exactly where he wanted to be. No longer just a rising star, but a fighter who had taken the hardest hit and still managed to walk out with a win. His career had just taken a massive leap forward, but he wasn't looking to rest on his laurels. He knew there were bigger challenges waiting on the horizon, and he was ready for them. As for the fans, the story of this fight became a narrative that would be passed down through UFC lore. It wasn't just about who had won or lost. It was about the journey both fighters had undergone. It was about the heart and the will to keep going, no matter what. It was about recognizing the limits of your own strength, and then breaking through them. For some, this fight was a moment of redemption, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. For others, it was a reminder that sometimes the hardest battles were the ones we fought with ourselves. And for many, this fight was just the beginning, because both Chimaev and Covington had shown that they were more than just competitors. They were warriors, willing to go to any lengths to leave their mark on the sport. As Chimaev stood in the spotlight, reflecting on his journey, he understood that the battle was not just a chapter in his career. It was a symbol of the larger story that would continue to unfold. The questions of what comes next, who would challenge him, and whether his career would continue on this upward trajectory remained unanswered, but the anticipation surrounding his future had reached an all-time high. This was no longer just about fighting for a title. It was about creating a legacy that would be remembered long after the final bell had rung. And whatever the future held, one thing was certain: Khamzat Chimaev had shown the world that he was more than just a fighter. He was a force of nature,